All right, so if you've just come this afternoon, my name is Keaton Halley. I did one of the sessions earlier this morning. I represent Creation Ministries International, and we exist to show that the book of Genesis gives us the true account of origins, that we can take at face value the Genesis narrative about the creation of the world in 6 days, Adam and Eve made in God's image by supernatural means, a worldwide flood in the time of Noah, the Tower of Babel, and so on. And so I have a couple of book tables there in the back right in front of the sound booth with lots of the resources that we produce to equip Christians with answers to the common objections to the Genesis account of creation. So we deal with the evolution controversy, we talk about dinosaurs, and evidence from science that shows Scripture is reliable. In my first session, we talked about the design in living things, the sophistication, complexity that living things exhibit demonstrates that they must have had a designer. If there's design in the world, it implies there must have been a designer, an intelligent God who created all these living things. So in one sense, I laid out the design argument for God's existence. In this session, we're going to look at another argument for God's existence. And there are many more, if you're not aware. If somebody ever says to you, there's no evidence that God is real, well, now you can use the design argument. You can, if you're familiar with others, there's the argument from reason. How are human beings equipped to understand the world we live in? If we just evolved from ape-like ancestors by blind processes, why should we expect our minds to work reliably to understand the world? It's only if we're created by a God of reason that it makes sense that our reasoning faculties can be trusted. The cosmological argument as well, from the cause of the universe. What brought the universe into being? The universe has not always been here. It has a finite age. The laws of science tell us that because of the expansion of the universe, because of thermodynamics that tells us the universe is decaying. The stars are burning up their fuel, and eventually everything will be cold and dark and dead. You rewind the clock backwards, it shows you the universe was wound up in the beginning. And how did that happen? It needs somebody who created the universe in the beginning, the cause of the universe. And so there's a whole group of these good reasons to believe that God is real. We don't have a blind faith as Christians. We have excellent reasons to put our trust in the God revealed in Scripture. But for this hour, we're going to talk about the moral argument for God's existence. Do we need God to explain morality? We all recognize that there is such a thing as right and wrong, good and evil, and I want to argue in this hour that God is the only explanation for those features of the world that makes sense. But many atheists would object. They would say, no, we can explain why we have moral rules. These just evolved by social and biological processes as human beings descended from ape-like ancestors. And so I want to analyze this debate in detail, and I want to make a case that moral laws demand a moral lawgiver. So as I say, we innately know that some things are right and others are wrong. You know, the Bible actually affirms this in Romans chapter 2. So last hour we looked at Romans 1, talks about evidence for the Creator from the creation. Well, the very next chapter talks about the moral law written on our hearts. The Apostle Paul wrote that when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. Right? So by law here, he's speaking about how God revealed the Ten Commandments, for example, to his people, the Israelites. And the Gentiles at that time didn't have that written law revealed by God. It was delivered to the Jewish people through Moses. But Paul says that they by nature just do what the law says. Because why? Because they show the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or excuse them. Did you know the whole concept of a conscience is a biblical idea? That word is used a number of places in Scripture. So it's not a concept that Disney made up in the Pinocchio movie. The Bible says that everybody has a conscience, a little whispering voice inside of us that tells us when we've done wrong. And we all feel guilty when we've done wrong things. That indicates that the moral law is, in fact, written on our hearts. And so this provides one strong piece of evidence that God is real. Because even non-Christians, even atheists, know that some things are not right. In fact, one common objection, maybe the major objection to believing in God, is known as the problem of evil, right? When somebody says, why would a good God make a world that's so filled with bad things, pain and suffering and death and so forth? But think about this. What does that whole argument against God presuppose? If evil is a problem for God, it presumes that evil is something real that we all know exists. But how can you have good and evil apart from a moral lawgiver? In fact, C.S. Lewis, the author of the Narnia books, he came to Christ as an adult. Before his conversion, he was an atheist. And he later, in this book, Mere Christianity, he reflected on the time before he believed in God. And he says, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But wait a minute, how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call something crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. See, there has to be a standard in order to even raise the problem of evil. You have to define what good and evil are, what is just and what is unjust. And that standard must come from God. And so it turns out the main argument against God, you can flip that around on the atheist and show how it turns out to be a great argument for God. But I want to spell that out in a bit more detail in our time in this hour. So to make a case that moral laws must be grounded in God, we can really divide that, it's kind of a conclusion as a result of an argument that consists of two parts. We can divide this case, our case for God, into two parts. Number one, step one, is that there are moral laws above human beings. I want to make a case why we should believe that that's true. So I'm going to talk about what I mean by moral laws and what I mean by above human beings. This is a reference to the concept of objective morality. The laws are not up to human beings. There are laws that stand outside of us and actually judge our behavior. There's an objective realm of moral values and duties, good and evil, right and wrong. So that's step one. We're going to try to deal with that first, establish that there are moral laws above human beings. And then in step two, we're asking what best explains them. I want to make a case that if there are laws above us, as we established in step one, then they must come from a personal authority above us. They're not just abstract concepts floating out there in the universe that we're obligated to obey, but they demand a personal authority that we owe allegiance to. There must be a lawgiver if there are indeed moral laws. And I think it's very important for us to kind of separate those two parts of the argument in our minds, because very often when you're dialoguing with someone who does not believe in God and you try to make a case, how can you have good and evil if you don't have God in the first place? They'll very often conflate these two parts of the argument, and you might get them to concede that part one is true, but then the minute you press point number two, if there are moral laws, then they come from a personal lawgiver, then they'll go back to denying step one. And so you want to be clear about what it is that you're discussing when you respond to their arguments. But let's take these one step at a time. First, we're going to deal with part one. Are there indeed moral laws above human beings? Another way of speaking about this is to refer to moral facts. Are there moral facts in the world? Now, what do I mean by moral facts? Well, we can distinguish between objective truth and subjective truth, right? Like, there's a claim here on the screen, there are 9 jelly beans in this picture. Whether that's right or wrong depends not on me and what I personally believe, it depends on the object, the jelly beans, and the number of them, right? Now, even if you said there are 8 jelly beans in this picture, that's not just a question about my personal preferences, it's an objective truth claim. It's a wrong truth claim. It's a wrong claim. Turns out not to be true, but it's a claim about objective reality outside of any human preference as an individual or as a group. No matter how many believe there are 8 jelly beans in that picture, there turn out to be 9. And the truth is determined by looking at the object. All right, so that's objective truth or objective claims. But what about another statement like chocolate is the best ice cream flavor? Some of you might agree with that. Others might say vanilla. I say cookie dough, I think is the best, or Butterfinger maybe supersedes all. But notice that's a subjective claim because really the truth value of this statement depends on who you're asking. You might say it's true for me that chocolate is the best ice cream flavor, right? There's no objective truth of the matter. It's not so much a statement about ice cream or chocolate. It's not about the object. It's about the subject, the person making the claim. So you could say it's true, but only in a subjective sense. Only true for me that chocolate is the best ice cream flavor. But the jelly bean example, it's not subjective. You don't say it's true for me that there are 9 jelly beans in the picture. So then when it comes to claims about morality, are we making objective claims or subjective claims? Are moral statements, assertions, like counting jelly beans, or are they like choosing ice cream flavors? We'll take a moral claim like this: murder is wrong. Is that an objective or subjective claim? Many people in our culture tend to think of claims about morality and religion as purely subjective, up to individuals or groups, and there is no truth of the matter for everyone, regardless of our opinions. But I think most of us, when we're considering a very stark and clear moral claim, there is a true answer that's not up to human opinion. I think most would agree, just by reflecting on moral situations, considering our intuition, that we know in our heart of hearts it is wrong to murder. And even if someone tries to deny that and says it's not an objective claim, that it's just a human preference, subjective, you can go to further and further extremes of more and more obvious moral truths. Because sure, there are plenty of moral, claims that people can debate about, and it's hard to know when there might be a complicated or murky moral situation. But you just refer to some, at least there are some clear-cut examples, Do you believe that racism is wrong? Do you believe that genocide is wrong? Do you believe it's wrong to torture babies just for the fun of it, right? You can go to more and more extreme examples to show we all know intuitively that some things are right and others are wrong. So when you make a claim like murder is wrong, we're not just saying, I don't care for it. That would be a subjective claim. We're saying something about reality, the object, the act of murder itself is morally wrong, and so that shows how there are moral laws that are not up to human beings. They're not mere subjective preferences. They are true for all people. And yet, despite how obvious that is, to deny something like that murder is wrong is true would be just as radical as denying that the physical world is real. We can perceive the physical world with our senses. Well, we can perceive the truth value of moral claims with our natural intuitions, the moral law on our hearts, as the Bible would put it. But nevertheless, there are many atheists who would say morality is relative. Like Paul Kurtz, this philosopher known as the father of secular humanism. What's his view of morality? He says the moral principles that govern our behavior are rooted in habit and custom, feeling, and fashion. Does he believe morality is objective or subjective? He has a subjective view. It's like just a convention, like driving on the right-hand side of the road, and there is no objective truth of the matter, a law outside of what we invent. But that cannot be right. If that's your view of morality, if you confront an atheist who has this subjective view, you can just challenge them with these moral situations. Do you really believe that genocide is okay? I don't believe that you actually live your life on the basis of treating all moral claims as though they are subjective. One other way to characterize the difference here is moral realism versus moral relativism. Moral realism would be saying that truth about morality is objective. Moral relativism says that claims about morality are subjective. And if you think about that, that maybe helps to make it clearer that when we're talking about objective morality, we're really saying that there are moral facts. There is such a thing as right and wrong. If you believe in moral relativism, by contrast, that's not really a form of morality. It's denying that there is any true thing as morality. When we talk about morality, all it is human preferences, then there's really no such thing as an innate right and wrong. There's just human opinions, and nobody can judge anybody else. And yet relativists, as I say, can't live their life pretending good and evil are fictions, because sooner or later, even those who espouse relativism will make moral judgments. You just give them a little bit of time, or maybe wait till they encounter somebody who cuts in front of them in line or steals their lunch, and they're going to say, that's not right, because they also know in their heart of hearts that morality is objective. If somebody tells you that they're a moral relativist, ask them if what the Nazis did was wrong. In fact, when some of these Nazis were rounded up and brought to trial at Nuremberg and treated as war criminals, they were tried for their war crimes, the defense attorneys arguing on behalf of the Nazis actually made a kind of a relativistic argument about morality. They said, well, look, our clients were being obedient to German law. According to German law, it was okay to kill Jews, and they were just following the orders of their superiors. So how can you, as an independent country that doesn't have superiority over Germany, how can you punish us for crimes that were permissible in our culture? You don't have the right to judge us for these things. All that's happening here in this courtroom is a power play of victors exerting their power over the vanquished. But the prosecution lawyers said, no, this is not just a matter of us exerting our power over you. There is a higher law than German law. I don't care what your laws in Germany said, those can be judged by a standard that's even above Germany. And if you agree with the prosecution, if you want to say that what the Nazis did was truly morally evil, then you have to believe that there is a higher law above any human court, even a sovereign nation. In fact, built on this, we can discuss 3 specific problems with relativism. Problem number 1 is that if there is no standard for good and evil, right and wrong, you can't judge someone else's behavior as good or bad, at least not consistently. You can say you don't like it, but you have no moral basis for condemning anyone's actions. You can't say that Adolf Hitler, who liked to kill and gas the Jews, is any worse than Billy Graham, who liked to befriend the Jews, right? Without an objective standard, a higher law above human beings, you can't judge between these two. You can't really praise morally good actions or give blame and judgment on what you call evil actions, because there is no longer any such thing as good or evil. And when we condemn Hitler, we're not merely saying we don't like what he did. We're saying it's wrong regardless of how many people are on his side. Even if the majority of people disapprove of something, that is not what makes something wrong. If good and evil are objective, then it's not up to the majority opinion. There are plenty of things in the world today that much of society disapproves of, like socks with sandals, but that doesn't make such a practice evil. It's just unpopular. And by contrast, the terrorists who flew airplanes into the Twin Towers in New York on September 11, that's not merely unpopular, it's objectively evil. And even if the terrorists had been successful in killing everyone who disagreed with them or brainwashing the entire world so that everyone agreed that what they did was morally right, it would still be wrong, because whether it's right or wrong is not up to us. There's a higher law. I think we can all see that based on the moral law that's written on our hearts. Problem number 2 with relativism. Without a standard, society can't morally improve. How could you have such a thing as moral progress if there are no moral facts. If it's just a matter of, well, one person has one preference, another person has another, then it's like choosing between Pepsi and Coke or vanilla and chocolate, right? How can a society get better or worse, morally speaking, if there is no such thing as morality? Take the efforts of William Wilberforce in the United Kingdom to overcome the slave trade in his country, or Martin Luther King Jr. in this country, securing civil rights for African Americans. Are those changes for the good? Almost everyone today would say yes, and yet that can't be the case if moral relativism is true. There's a change in our moral attitudes, but this would not be the same as moral progress unless there's a standard that's above human beings. So problem number one with relativism, you can't judge any behavior as right or wrong. Problem number two, you can't improve as an individual or as a society morally. And problem number three is that you yourself are not bound to act morally if there's no moral law. Without a standard, there are no moral obligations. If there are no rules, you don't have to obey them either. One way to think about this third problem might be to consider who would be the hero of every moral system. You know, if your moral standard is nonviolent resistance, then Gandhi might be someone you look up to as the epitome of that moral system. If your moral system says that the highest, greatest good is loving the Lord God with all your heart, your soul, mind, and strength, then Jesus would be the exemplar, the hero of that moral system. But who would be the hero of relativism? If morals are really just subjective, up to individuals or societies, well, there's a great book on relativism where Greg Kokel and Frank Beckwith answer this question. They say, what do we call those who most thoroughly apply the principles of relativism, caring nothing for others' ideas of right or wrong, those unmoved by others' notions of ethical standards, and instead consistently follow the beat of their own moral drum? In our society, we have a name for these people. They are a homicide detective's worst nightmare. The quintessential relativist is a sociopath, one with no conscience. This is what relativism produces. You could say a consistent relativist would be someone like a Ted Bundy, serial killer, rapist, kidnapper who murdered at least 30 people. He lived totally for himself and didn't worry about what others thought of his behavior. And it's not that if there's no moral law above us that you're obligated to do what Ted Bundy did, but the problem is rather that there's no law against it. You can do this if you want to. Some people may choose not to live this way, but there's no moral law saying that you cannot. If there's no standard, you can do anything you want, and it's not evil. But again, if you believe this is evil, then you have to believe that there's a law, moral law above any human court, above individuals and groups of humans, because moral laws are not up to us. They stand outside of us, and they themselves judge our behavior. So, I think we've established, step one, there clearly are moral facts. There are moral laws above human beings. So with that step in place, let's move on to part two, arguing that if indeed there are these moral laws above us, then they must come from a personal authority. And that's because moral obligations, if you think about it, they include like an oughtness to them, right? That's what the whole concept of a moral law is. It's a bit different than physical laws, like gravity. You kind of have no choice but to obey the law of gravity, especially if you step off of a building. You have no choice but to go down. But moral laws present us with a choice. They say we ought to do one thing and not another, but we can choose which way to go. And yet, if we disobey the moral law, then we not only feel guilty, we are objectively guilty. But how could this be if the whole universe came into being without a creator? If all we have in the universe are just molecules banging around, and nobody intended this universe for a purpose, if there's no meaning and purpose and significance behind the world, and it's just physical objects doing what physical objects do, where does this idea of a law come from? Why do we have a duty, an obligation to obey, to behave in a certain way? Where does oughtness, where does incumbency come from? Why are there thou shalts and thou shalt nots? It seems that moral laws have to come from an authority, a source of authority that's over us. And God makes the best sense as that authority, since no human can serve as that authority. Now, many atheists want to separate morality from God. They might agree with step one that there are moral laws above human beings, but then they try to deny that God has to be the foundation. Back in 2008, the American Humanist Association ran these advertisements on buses in Washington, D.C., and it was around Christmas time, so you can see that they've got the snowflakes there, and in fact, the language here riffs off the Christmas song, Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Look at what they said. Why believe in a God? Just be good for goodness sake. See, they recognize that most people in the world connect being goodness with the moral authority of God. Now, do these atheists believe in a moral law? Are they saying, don't worry about right or wrong, there's no such thing? No, they believe everyone ought to be good, right? That's their moral law, that they recognize we have an obligation to be good. They just want to separate that obligation from a moral lawgiver. But does their case work? If there is no lawgiver, how could there be a law? Why do we have just some abstract obligation to goodness itself, as though it's like this principle that's floating out there in the universe? Do we have an obligation to obey this sign just because we've read it? Do we have an obligation to obey it because of the authority of the atheists who wrote these words? Do we have an obligation to the impersonal universe that's just blind forces and humans are just accidental byproducts of an evolutionary process if atheism is true? None of those ideas make sense to me. I don't see how you can derive an ought from an is. In fact, books on logic call that the naturalistic fallacy. If the universe simply is, you can't derive from that the concept of an objective ought, a thou shalt not. Maybe you can think about it this way. If I ran out into traffic with a handmade, homemade sign with the words, the letters S-T-O-P, right? If I make a handmade stop sign and run out into traffic, are the cars obligated to obey my sign? No. And why not? Because I don't have the proper authority. But if a police officer holds a stop sign out in traffic, then we are obligated to stop because he's a proper authority, exercising his authority in a proper way. And where does the government get its authority? Well, the Bible tells us that it has to be traced back to an ultimate authority. As it says in Romans 13, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. And it's not only political governments, but moral laws themselves, like stealing is wrong. Those only make sense as well if they come from a higher authority that's above us and not merely up to us. Now, interestingly, on this second point, where does the moral law come from? It has to come from a personal authority. Even many atheists would concede that second point, and that's why so many atheists are relativists, right? Like Paul Kurtz that I quoted earlier. Why does he think there is no such thing as right and wrong, that it's just habits and customs and feelings and fashions? Because he doesn't believe in God. He recognizes that without God, there would be no moral law above us. And so for him to think that way is to concede this second step of the argument, that God is necessary in order to have right and wrong in the first place. Remember, step one is that we can tell there really are moral laws above us. Step two is where did they come from? And many atheists, by believing in relativism, show that they admit this second part of the argument is correct. However, there are plenty who would make a case that, no, we don't need God to explain moral laws because evolution can explain how we came to have moral rules in our society. They say, humans are social primates, and although, natural selection might have ingrained in us certain practices that are, like a tendency to fight with other human beings and, battle each other in the struggle for survival, at the same time, evolution would ingrain in us a tendency to treat others nicely, because the more you cooperate with other people, the more likely they will be likely to be nice to you in return, right? You scratch my back, I scratch yours. And you can sort of see the logic in this argument that through the years, as evolution operated on us and our social, culture works on us, that if we lie and cheat and steal and murder, we'd be ostracized by the rest of society and less likely, therefore, to pass on our DNA. And so you can kind of see how evolution could ingrain in us a tendency to behave in ways that we consider morally good, to be nice to our neighbors and not murder them, right? So is this a good explanation for morality? Well, here's where it's very critical that we've already talked about these two different steps of the argument. What is it that the atheists, when they make this claim, evolution can explain morality, are they trying to say that true morality exists, moral facts, a higher law above us, and that's what evolution explains? How could it possibly do that? How could social instincts, even if they make us behave, they give us certain tendencies, maybe it can explain why we feel guilty and tend to treat our neighbors with respect, but is that really a true moral law that's not just inside human beings, but outside of us? A higher law that we're really obligated to obey? No. No evolutionist would actually claim that when they stop and think about it. It doesn't give us transcendent moral laws. All it would do is explain away morality. It would say, this is not true morality, it's just people being nice to get along for pragmatic reasons. But it's not a real law above us. Or, if they do reject step number one and try to say this can explain step number two, again, how could it possibly do that? An evolutionary morality is not objective morality, it's a subjective morality. It's not explaining moral facts, but explaining them away. All right, so here's one evolutionist, scientist, he's a philosopher, Michael Ruse, passed away just a couple of years ago. Michael Ruse, who believes in evolution and doesn't believe in God, look what he says about morality. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such a reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. So does he believe that morality is objective or subjective? And once again, it's subjective, right? If evolution can explain so-called morality, it's not really explaining a transcendent, objective moral law above us. All it's saying is the reason we tend to behave in these ways is because of evolution, but that's not real morality. He himself says it's just an aid to survival and reproduction. And so are we really obligated to follow those inclinations that evolutionists give us? No, we can actually live in a different way once we recognize that there's no moral law, there's just our impulses, our inclinations, our feelings of guilt and shame and so forth. In fact, many atheists would have to admit that even if this evolutionary explanation works, evolution would not only ingrain in us a tendency to behave in ways that we call morally good, but also it gives us tendencies and impulses and inclinations to behave in ways that we know are wrong. Take Sam Harris, another well-known atheist today. He says, there are many things about us for which we are naturally selected, which we repudiate in moral terms. For instance, and he gets a bit serious here, he says there's nothing more natural than rape. Human beings rape, chimpanzees rape, orangutans rape. Rape clearly is a part of an evolutionary strategy to get your genes into the next generation if you're a male. But is he saying that therefore rape is okay? No. He says you can't move from that Darwinian fact about us to defend rape as a good practice. I mean, no one would be tempted to do that. We have transcended that part of our evolutionary history in repudiating it. But wait a minute, this admits that whatever evolution ingrains in us, a tendency for certain behaviors, you're not obligated to follow those impulses. You can rebel against them if you want to, but that would apply to what we call good and what we call bad. So once again, can evolution supply that moral law? It is a true moral obligation? No, it just gives us these pressures to live our lives in a certain way, even if it were true. What's the standard, the higher standard to judge whether an evolutionary impulse is right or wrong? It doesn't come from evolution. It once again has to be a higher law, a standard above human beings to tell you that rape is wrong and loving your neighbor is right. Evolution therefore gives us relative morality, if it gives us anything at all. I don't even believe that evolution is true based on what we talked about in my first lecture, but it certainly can't give us real morality. And so even a well-known atheist like Richard Dawkins, though he's a passionate defender of Darwinian evolution, look what he admits here about how Darwinism relates to morality. I'm a passionate Darwinian when it comes to science, when it comes to explaining the world, but I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to morality and politics. So evolution, in the end, provides no good explanation of the moral laws above us. Laws must come from a personal authority, a lawgiver. And so that brings us right back to our conclusion. Step one, we saw there are moral laws above human beings. And step two, since there are moral laws above us, they must come from a personal authority above us. So I think that conclusion is very strong just based on, sort of like thinking through moral scenarios. What do we believe in our heart of hearts? We know some things are right and others are wrong, and the only way that we can have these moral laws is from an authority above us. But many atheists will say, okay, even if we can't answer that argument, I don't think God is an advance. It doesn't help us solve the problem because they raise a dilemma for Christians. Now, some of you might have heard of this before. Maybe you've not heard the name Euthyphro dilemma, but it's called Euthyphro dilemma because Euthyphro was a character in one of Plato's writings. So way back in Plato's time, he already brought this challenge up, and many philosophers today continue to think this is a serious challenge to the idea that God is the standard for right and wrong. And it goes like this. Is something good just because God says so? Well, if that were the case, then it would seem that God could have declared something else to be right, maybe the opposite of what we think of as right. Is it just up to God's kind of arbitrary decision what we call good? It doesn't seem like morality can be just arbitrary, as if God might have decided to give us the opposite of the Ten Commandments. Could God have said, thou shalt murder, thou shalt bear false witness, thou shalt commit adultery, and so forth? That seems crazy. In fact, the scripture even gives us some indication that that can't be the right understanding. It says, I think it's in the book of Hebrews, it's impossible for God to lie. See, there are certain things God cannot do, like learn or love you less, or he can't commit acts of moral evil because morality is necessarily what it is. It could not have been something different. Well, what about the alternative that Euthyphro offers? He says, okay, if that first option is not right, what about this second option? Or does God say something is good because it already is good, apart from him? If God says something is good because it already is innately good, then it seems like God is superfluous. Is he just the middleman, kind of ratifying a higher moral law that's not up to him? Goodness already exists. There's a law that God himself is obligated to affirm. That doesn't seem to be the right answer either, given that that would favor the atheist view that God doesn't help us to account for morality. So it's a dilemma, right? We're presented with, sometimes philosophers refer to this as the two horns of the dilemma, almost like a matador facing a raging bull, right? And no matter which direction you go, left or right, you're going to be gored by one horn or the other of this dilemma. If we go to the left, then it would seem God is not good. The concept of goodness is arbitrary. If we go to the right, then God himself is subject to a higher standard, and he's not sovereign over everything. Well, the common Christian answer to this challenge is that it's not a true dilemma. It's a false dilemma. A false dilemma is when you're presented with two possible options as though they exhaust all the possibilities, but those aren't the only options. And so even Plato himself pointed to a third way. Just like matadors don't have to go only left or right, they have other options available. Christians have long pointed out there's a great answer to this challenge, and that is that goodness is not outside of God, but it's also not rooted in his mere decision, his will. It's rooted in his unchanging and eternal and immutable character. How is that different from the other two options? Well, God's character is innate, a part of him. It's not something that could change. And God himself is necessary in his existence. He cannot fail to exist. He always has existed, and he exists necessarily. And so the standard for right and wrong is rooted inside God, but in his character, not just his whim or his arbitrary say-so. Well, with all that then in place, we can answer the question I had at the beginning in the subtitle of my talk, which is, can we be good without God? I would argue the answer to that question is no, provided that we understand the question properly. I'm not saying that we have to believe in God in order to recognize right and wrong or in order to do good acts. The question is not about whether we have to have belief in God in order to be good. The question is, does God have to exist in order for us to be good? And that, as we've seen, is the case. There would be no such thing as right or wrong without God as the epitome of goodness, the standard on which we base right and wrong. Now, when you make that kind of a claim, sometimes people get upset, atheists especially. They think that you're saying that you have to believe in God in order to be good, and that's not my claim at all. I think ultimately, like Jesus said, God is the only one who's truly good. But in a looser sense of, can an atheist just be a generally good person, loving their neighbor and doing good works? I believe that is the case. But the very fact that they can be good shows that they're wrong in their atheism. It would not be possible for them to truly be good unless God was real. If that's a bit confusing, here's kind of an analogy for that. Imagine you met someone who did not believe in authors. How would you convince someone that authors exist? Well, you could point to a stack of books and say, the only way we could have these books is if there were authors. And the atheist might say, what are you talking about? I don't believe in authors. I can still see these books. I can still read the books. I appreciate books. I know that books exist. I'm just denying authors. Yeah, I know. I'm not saying that you can't see the books as a denier of authors. I'm not saying you can't read them as a denier of authors. I'm saying the fact that you can read them shows that authors must exist, because there would be no books if there were no authors. And in the same way, you can be good without believing in God, but you can't be good without God. It's only because God is real that goodness is possible. And God himself is the morally perfect lawgiver. As we've seen, our conscience tells us that some things are right and some things are wrong. It's impossible to live otherwise. The idea that evolution gives us morality is completely misguided. All it could do at best is give us impulses, inclinations, not true moral obligations. It might get us in trouble with other members of society, but those would just be human beings imposing a subjective morality on us, not true objective morality that stands above us. Rather, laws must be rooted in God's authority, a proper authority located in the epitome of goodness himself, located not in God's arbitrary say-so or a law above him, but in God's essential nature. As we read in Deuteronomy 32, verse 4, the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. Well, beyond this, we have a lot of resources that I brought with me that I want to get rid of and not take back home to Atlanta. So if you want to learn more about the evidence for God's existence from a variety of philosophical arguments and the scientific evidence that backs it up as well, you might want to check out our book tables. We've got a fantastic family-friendly creation magazine that comes out 4 times a year. Full-color pictures, no paid advertising, 56 pages in each issue. So a lot of meaty content that defends biblical creation based on new information that we're gaining all the time. As science learns more and more, we continually see how it backs up the authority of God's Word. Some other great tools might be this starter pack. You can get these 3 books packaged together for a discount. Two books and a video. The Answers book, Refuting Evolution, the most popular creation book of all time. Great for high school students to deal with the kind of propaganda they'll learn about in the classrooms. And then Genesis, the Key to the Gospel, talks about how Genesis is foundational to the faith, but how we can defend it as true history. We don't only deal with creation. We sometimes have resources that go a bit more broadly into apologetics, like this book, Christianity for Skeptics, deals with evidence for God, deals with other religions like Islam and Eastern religions, asks about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. How does the historical evidence point to the truth of the resurrection, and much more. A commentary on Genesis 1 to 11 is a great tool for pastors or Bible teachers that are here. We are on all the social media sites as well, so you might want to follow us on X or YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and so forth. And last but not least, we have a fantastic website as well with 50 years worth of creation evidences and arguments available at your fingertips. So I do hope you'll bookmark that on your smartphones, and students especially, when you are doing a paper on creation versus evolution or anything related to science and faith, our website would be a great resource tool for you guys to use. All right, so thank you so much for your attention, and I will turn things back over. God.